Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, a lot of people who are only half paying attention to the election campaign more or less assumed it was in the bag for the Tories. But now the polls have been closing a bit, they're having to focus for the first time on the real possibility of Jeremy Corbyn becoming Prime Minister. And that means almost certainly that Diane Abbott would take over the Home Office, and she joins me now. Diane Abbott, a lot of people watching this programme after Manchester, thinking about who to vote for, look at you and look at Jeremy Corbyn and think, do you know what, we don't completely trust you to be in charge of the security of this country, given what you have said in the past, some of the things you have done in the past. You can take a moment now to, as it were, talk to them and tell them why they're wrong about you.
Well, first of all, before we move on to the politics of it, I think it's too soon to forget the victims. 22 people dead, and also so many people, families and children, who have seen things which will haunt them for many years.
Quite right. We have talked a lot about the victims, but quite right.
I think it's important to say that. In terms of why people should vote Labour in the forthcoming general election, they should vote Labour because we've put forward a manifesto which will be a transforming manifesto, which is talking about investment in the NHS and education, and is also saying how we would fund it.
And I'm going to come on to that manifesto in some detail in a moment. But before we do, I just want to ask about your own record. And people looking at you and they say, I don't trust Diane Abbott to be in charge of the Home Office. Well,
first of all, I think there's something to be said for a Home Secretary who's actually worked in the Home Office. I worked in the Home Office for nearly 3 years as a graduate trainee, and I know how it works from the inside. I think there's something to be said for a Home Secretary who is a very young woman, worked and campaigned with diverse communities, and sees these issues not just from the point of view of bureaucrats, but from the point of view of diverse communities. And there's also something to be said for a Home Secretary who spent 30 years as a constituency MP and knows how these issues impact on ordinary people.
What about a Home Secretary who has in the past said that we should abolish MI5?
Well, I think you've got that from some
early day motion which you signed in 1989. I can read it back to you if you'd like me to. She said she called for the abolition of conspiratorial groups like MI5 and Special Branch, which are not accountable to the British people. Signed by Diane Abbott.
At that time, I and a lot of people felt MI5 needed reforming. It has since been reformed, and of course I would not call for its abolition now.
So you have, that Diane Abbott statement has gone and you're pro-MI5, you're a supporter of MI5.
No, I'm saying that MI5 has gone. It's been reformed, it's a different MI5, and that's why so many of us are able to support it now.
And you fully support it because also in your career in the House of Commons, you voted again and again, around 30 times, against anti-terrorist legislation for different reasons.
What you have to remember is that on many of those occasions, I and Jeremy Corbyn were going through the lobby with Tory MPs. Theresa May herself voted against the 2005 Prevention of Terrorism Bill. She voted against ID cards, and she voted against control orders without sufficient legal intervention. And my point is this: nobody votes against these things without a lot of thought. And the view of myself and Jeremy and most members of the Conservative Party, including David Davis at the time, was this was counterproductive, counter-terror legislation.
Okay,
and some of the positions we voted for were upheld in the courts.
Let me come on to your bit. You say nobody votes against these kind of things without a lot of thought. Shortly before 9/11, you voted against prescribing Al-Qaeda as an organisation. That was a huge mistake on your part, was it not?
Have you actually read the legislation we were voting on?
I have read the legislation and I've looked at the addendums as well.
And
I've got here.
What the legislation brought forward was a whole list of organisations, some of which some people would argue were not terrorist organisations, but dissident organisations. Well, and to say that because
which ones? Because I've got the list here. Al-Qaeda, Egyptian Islamic Jihad, the Armed Islamic Group, Harakat Mujahideen, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad Group, Islamic Army of Aden, the Abu Nidal organisation, the Kurdistan Workers' Party. Which of these should not be prescribed?
The titles are one thing, but the reality of some of those groups, whether they were dissidents in their country of origin, and that's why some of us were not willing. Had they taken out Al-Qaeda as one thing, that would have been something. But, you know,
this is a group of really dangerous organisations from all around the world, many of whom have killed a lot of people. Lashkar-e-Taiba carried out the 2008 Mumbai attacks, which killed more than 170 people. That was on the list. This was, you know, no list is perfect, but it was a pretty good list, and you voted against prescribing those groups.
Because there were groups on that list which I deem to be dissidents rather than terror organisations. You have to give people credit for thinking about how they vote. As I said to you earlier, we're hearing about all this anti-terror legislation that Jeremy and I voted against, but we're not hearing that the Tories voted against some of the self-same legislation, particularly control orders and detention without trial.
Well, there is the list. Which of those organisations do you think should not have been prescribed? Because, you know, you voted against the whole lot being prescribed because presumably some of them you thought were OK. I'm just wondering which ones you think are OK.
It's not that I thought they were OK. I thought that they were dissident organisations.
You can have the list if you'd like it.
No, I don't need it, Andrew, because the point is, at this point, less than a week after those people died in Manchester, we should be talking about how we go forward to make this country safe.
But to know how to go forward, we have to look behind and look at people's records, which is why I've been talking about you. Now, Jeremy Corbyn got into some trouble with Andrew Neil in his interview where he said he had not met the IRA, and he was then photographed lots of people from the IRA during the course of his career. You yourself said that it would be a defeat for the British state would be a great liberation, a great move forward at that period of time. Do you regret your support for the IRA right back in the 80s?
That particular quote you're referring to comes from a now defunct left newspaper, and it had, as well as
but
this...
you said it, didn't you?
No, but what I'm saying to you is this. It was 34 years ago. I had a rather splendid afro at the time. I don't have the same hairstyle. And I don't have the same views. It is 34 years on. The hairstyle has gone and some of the views have gone.
So you no longer, you regret the fact of what you said then about the IRA?
The hairstyle has gone, the views have gone. We've all moved on in 34 years, haven't you, Andrew? We've
all moved on. I'm just wondering, do you regret what you said about the IRA at the height of the bombing? What
specifically do you want me to regret?
Well, I can read the quote for you and find it here. Basically, what you said was that a defeat of the IRA would be devastating for the British people, and it was a defeat for the British state was a good thing, you said, at the time when the IRA was attacking the British state. And you said that the reason for the violence was entirely caused by the British presence in Northern Ireland. I'm saying, do you think those statements now are wrong?
It was 34 years ago. I've moved on.
You've moved on. All right. I've got the quote here, finally. You said, the Ireland is our struggle. Every defeat of the British state is a victory for all of us. A defeat in Northern Ireland will be a defeat indeed, was the quote.
34 years ago, and I've moved on.
OK. And within a few weeks, you could be Home Secretary. And one of the things we know from Amber Rudd that she spends 2 hours a day signing orders approving the surveillance of individual people. Would you be prepared to sit there now and do that?
Of course, if the evidence was presented to me. Remember, I was a Home Office civil servant. I know how these things work. So if the files are put in front of me, evidence is put in front of me, of course I'll sign orders for surveillance. That's very much part of the job.
OK, let's turn to another big issue, I think, today, which is encrypted services on WhatsApp and other mobile messaging devices. Do you oppose or support forcing those companies to reveal what they're doing?
I think the problem with a lot of these companies, they're American companies, and they feel very strongly about the right to free speech and so on. But we do have to work with them to allow us to access some of these messages. There is an issue about end-to-end encryption. We have to work with them. And if they're not willing to cooperate, we do have to consider what further action we could take. But I would hope, given the tragedy in Manchester, that these companies would want to work with the British government.
OK. Let's turn to something else. Again, I'm afraid reported in today's papers, which is that as recently as 2010, you told a dinner party, we shouldn't put innocent people's DNA on the database, fair point, and we shouldn't even have guilty people on that database either. Again, as somebody who's going to be Home Secretary, do you still support that statement?
What you have to remember is I'm also a constituency MP, and I've had to deal with some very difficult cases of children who'd not actually been convicted of anything, who had their DNA on the database, and I had a huge struggle to get their DNA taken off. So yes, we do need to be careful about taking children's DNA. Children have not been convicted of a crime.
You didn't use the word children there.
Yes, because I don't know where that story comes from, but what was on my mind was a case I was dealing with at the time about a child whose DNA had been taken.
So it can be very, very clear. In terms of retaining a strong DNA national database, are you in favour of that or against it?
I'm in favour of a DNA database. I'm not in favour of keeping the DNA of children who've committed no crime.
Only children. So anybody else who's guilty of some crime or has been found guilty of that, their DNA should be kept. Do you agree with that?
Yes,
you do agree with that? OK, well, let's move on. One of your big announcements has been lots more officers, including another 1,000 people for the security services. Now, they are already increasing by 1,000 after David Cameron's government. Is this another 1,000 beyond that?
No, but that 1,000 hasn't been recruited. And what we're saying
They're doing it at the moment, they say.
They say, but they haven't recruited them yet. So we're saying that we want to recruit 10,000 extra police officers, community police officers, because we think community policing is key. We want to recruit 3,000 extra firefighters, 3,000 extra prison officers, 1,000, as you say, people in the security field, and 500 more border guards, because we think protecting our border is so important.
So you know the next question. How much extra are you going to spend on MI5?
Well, on MI5 we're not spending extra because the government's put the money aside. Altogether...
So this is not really a new announcement at all?
No, well, it's part of our Community Safety Pledge card, and altogether the things we're talking about, the 10,000 extra police officers, and remember, the reason that we've had to promise 10,000 extra police officers is that on Theresa May's watch, there are 20,000 police officers down. So the cost of the entire package, which is 10,000 extra police officers, 3,000 firefighters, 3,000 prison officers, 1,000 security people and 500 border guards, will be 417 million.
Got the number. Well done. Thank you very much indeed. Now, in the Labour Party manifesto, it says, freedom of movement will end when we leave the European Union. No ifs, no buts. Are you in support of that policy?
Freedom of movement obviously ends when we leave the EU. We only have freedom of movement as part and parcel of being in the EU.
And a Labour government will end it?
If we leave the European Union, freedom of movement ends. What we should be talking about is the immigration arrangements we have when freedom of movement ends. There's no question that it ends when we come out of the EU.
It's just that you have said ending free movement has become a synonym for anti-immigrant racism. Which suggests that the Labour Party manifesto has got lots of anti-immigrant racism in it.
No, I don't think you're reading the manifesto properly. Of course, I think that anti-immigrant rhetoric is toxic and actually very bad for business. We are seeing the numbers of EU migrants going down at a time when we are 24,000 nurses short. So anti-immigrant rhetoric is unpleasant, but also bad for the economy. But on freedom of movement ends when we come out of the EU.
If you win the election and you become Home Secretary, you will be the first black person in any one of the major 4 offices of state. It will be a huge change. Will you run the Home Office differently in terms of its attitude to racism, communities and so forth? Will we notice a step change having a black Home Secretary running the Home Office?
I will run the best Home Office that I can. I'll draw on my experience having worked there. I'll draw on my experience as an MP at the grassroots. But we will have the best Home Office that I can run, which will draw on some of the Home Office's best traditions. And above all, will keep this country safe.
Diane Abbott, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. Now, coming up later this morning, Jo Coburn will have all the election campaign latest, and she's going to be talking to the Security Minister, Ben Wallace, and the Shadow Justice Secretary, Richard Burden. That's the Sunday Politics at 11 here on BBC One. I'm joined now by the current Home Secretary, the Conservative Amber Rudd. Amber Rudd, welcome. A lot of people watching this and remembering what has happened this week, we think after Manchester there has to be a step change, a completely different attitude to security in this country. Do you agree with them?
I believe that there's information we can gather and the steps we can take to improve this country's security. But be in no doubt, this is something that this country has been prepared for. The threat level has been at severe now since 2014, which is an attack is highly likely. We've invested in our intelligence services, we've invested in counter-terrorism, we've made sure that we put the tools in place. Actually, there'll be as many armed police by the end of this year as there have ever been. So we are stepping that up all the time. This hasn't come out of the blue, very sadly. This is something that we've been prepared for, we've been rehearsing for. And one other thing I would like to just say is that the reason why the handling of this terrible atrocity was done so well in Manchester by the emergency services, which I'd like to thank, and by everybody involved, by the people who volunteered, is because we had rehearsed for it.
Let's turn, if I may, before we get on to the main bit of the interview, to the latest, as it were. You've downgraded the threat level 1 point.
Yes.
And we hear that a large part of the group around this terrorist have been apprehended and taken. Does that mean that some of the group are still out there?
Potentially. I mean, it's an ongoing operation. There are 11 people in custody. The operation is still at full tilt in a way, and so until the operation is complete, we can't be entirely sure that it's closed.
Now, clearly, as you said, the security services do a great job and all the rest of it. Nonetheless, there are questions that must be asked. Can I ask you how many times the security services were tipped off about Salman Abedi before he attacked?
Well, it's not for me to be drawn in on what the intelligence services did or didn't know, particularly at this stage, Andrew.
Well, the trouble is we do know some stuff about this.
We do, but the fact is this is an ongoing operation. The fact that you've already asked me, are there other people that are going to be potentially pursued? That is because of the strong relationship between the intelligence services and the counter-terrorism policing. Of course, people will want to look afterwards to see whether there are signals that could have been learnt. How could we do this better? But can I also point out that since 2013, they have foiled 18 separate plots. They do a good job. We're not frightened, though, of learning lessons and improving.
I don't want in any way to diminish what they do. Nevertheless, what we do know is that Salman Abedi was identified as a dangerous man by friends and family, his community doing exactly what we asked them to do. They phoned the terror hotline 5 years ago and then again last year. We know that the imam in his local mosque used the prevent strategy again to get in touch and say this guy is out of control, he's dangerous, and apparently nothing happened. Can I ask you directly, was Salman Abedi on a surveillance list?
I don't know those details that you've just set out to me because the intelligence services are still collecting information about him and about the people around him. But I wouldn't rush to conclusions, as you seem to be, that they've somehow missed something.
I'm simply saying that people had phoned the terror hotline as they're told to do.
As they should do, as they should do. And this, you know, the reason we've put in place the terror hotline, the reason we've put in place the prevent strategy is because we recognise the scale of the problem. What this reminds us, if we needed reminding, is the scale of the problem that we have. The enemy that we have, Daesh, that is trying to weaponise the young people in our society. We have put in place measures to make sure we can protect us, but we have been at severe, as I said, for a number of years, which is a threat, an attack is highly likely. But we will look to see what else we can do, which is why the Prime Minister has announced, actually in our manifesto before this event, that there would be a commission for extremism, to see what else we can do to root out extremism, to put legislation in place if we need to make sure we take action to stop extremism taking root in our society.
I guess the problem with the manifesto is that it now reads a bit like, inevitably, a pre-Manchester manifesto. You're going to have a commission, there's lots of perhapses and maybes and pushing things forward and talking and so forth. It doesn't necessarily have the urgency that a lot of people feel is necessary after the Manchester attack.
This government has always felt that urgency. That's why we've been putting additional money, additional resources, and that's why also, I mean, it is significant that the Commission for Extremism that is in the manifesto was put in before Manchester. We know we need to do more. We recognise the scale of the threat, and that's one of the actions we're taking.
Across the country, how many serious potential jihadis are we worried about?
Well, the numbers have been confirmed by MI5 that they're looking at 500 different plots, 3,000 on a sort of top list, and then 20,000 underneath that. But that's all different layers, different tiers. You know, it might be just a question mark about one of them or something serious at the top of the top list.
I suppose what I'm wondering is the question about whether Abedi was red flagged or not at some point in the last few years may simply be because there are so many plots, so many people that they have to look at. One thing you could decide to do after Manchester is a step change in the size of MI5. You could double it. You could spend money that's being spent on Trident or something else and put it into this. Have you considered that?
We won't shy away from finding out what else we can do to keep people safe. I mean, the budget has already gone up significantly. We're recruiting 1,900 people for MI5. But, you know, we will look at this in a way to learn from it, to make sure that we keep people safe going forward. So if there is a need for more recruitment or more security or more armed vehicles, which we're investing in as well, we will look at doing that.
And if you win this general election and go back to the Home Office as Home Secretary, will it be business as usual with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor when it comes to budgets? Or are you going to say, look, we need to change this completely, we need a much, much bigger budget for this?
Well, can I just point out, from 2015 to 2020, we agreed to uplift the budget from 11 billion to 15 billion. But we will make sure that we put the right resources in to keep people safe, always.
OK, we were talking earlier on during the paper review about where Abedi had been, and we know that he's been to Libya. We think he may well have been to Syria. How many jihadis have come back from Syria to this country, do you think?
We don't know the exact number. What we do know is that in engaging with the intelligence services and with the police and with the border force, we make sure that they have the tools to track them and keep them out where we can.
Is it possible to tell where somebody has been when they come in? I mean, somebody comes through Heathrow, we don't know where they have been. They might have come in from Paris or Istanbul or wherever. How can we possibly know if they've been to Syria?
Well, it's all intelligence-led. And, you know, we have very good intelligence services who help to collect that information to make sure that we do, you know, follow and track the right people who might be dangerous.
Because the government has done one thing that could help you in this regard, which is to introduce temporary exclusion orders.
Yes.
How many of those have been used?
Well, I'm not going to give you the exact number, but I can say we have started to use them.
Because
so
it was zero until very recently.
It is no longer zero. It is part of the toolkit that a Home Secretary has so that we can keep people safe.
Can I move on to some of the other things that people have speculated you might need to look at now as a result of that? You have an entire strategy in place for trying to pick people up and identify them, but you got rid of Labour's control orders. Under the Labour government, control orders were highly controversial. There were lots of civil liberties issues, but they seemed to be effective and they were often very well used. And they included curfews and they included electronic tagging. If Abedi had been subject to that, he would not have been able to commit the Manchester atrocity.
The security services and the police have the tools that they need. We don't have control orders, we have TPIMs. They're more robust in legislation and we use them effectively. We are in constant discussion with the intelligence services and with the police to make sure that we have the right tools that they need. They have the ability to come to us, come to me as Home Secretary, and for me to sign off TPIMs. We will do that where we need to.
So TPIMs, for people who don't understand what they are, they're terrorism prevention and investigation measures, and they can include a form of house arrest. You've used them only 6 or 7 times so far.
Well, slightly more than that, but again, I can't give you the exact number because it's a quarterly reporting method. But, you know, it's not for me to say how many TPIMs should be out there. It's for me to say to the intelligence services who will keep us safe, tell me how many you need, what the evidence is, and then we'll take them forward.
The reason I ask you about this, Home Secretary, is that Lord Carlisle, the former independent reviewer of terror legislation, said it was a grave mistake by the coalition government to remove control orders and to produce something which he called was more dilute.
Well, I think that quote may be out of date because Mr. Anderson, who was the reviewer as well, subsequently to him, has said that they represent the mature evolution following control orders. And Max Hill, just today, who's the reviewer for terrorist legislation, has told us that there is no more legislation needed currently. So we are constantly alert and we won't shy away from introducing new legislation when it's needed, but I think we have the tools in place at the moment.
The last time we talked, after another terrible terrorist attack in London, we had a discussion about end-to-end encryption.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of comment after about what was possible and was not possible.
Indeed.
Can I ask you directly to explain what your proposal is now?
We are making good progress with the companies who have put in place end-to-end encryption. Some of them are being more constructive than others, but we will continue to build on that. The area that I'm most concerned about is the internet companies who are continuing to publish the hate publications, the hate material that is contributing to radicalising people in this country. I also spoke about setting up an internet forum, which we did in the UK, and now the Prime Minister has announced just this week, coming back from the G7, that she's agreed to do an international forum. So we're continuing to build on better relationships with the internet, to ask them, as the experts, to make those changes so that people don't get radicalised and the terrorists don't have somewhere to hide.
OK, the problem with end-to-end encryption is that the technology to achieve that the software is out there, freely available all over the internet. You can make your own. And so if a terrorist is using WhatsApp, for instance, and you make WhatsApp give you a backdoor in, they just simply can move to another messaging service, and then another, and another, and another, and eventually, if you close them all off from end-to-end encryption, then they can build their own. The only way that you could stop this is by banning end-to-end encryption completely.
Well, what we're doing is challenging the people who are developing and delivering end-to-end encryption to work with us so that we have a way of keeping people safe. Nobody wants terrorists to have a safe place to exchange information and to be able to plot their terrible atrocities. I believe we can get them to be more successful in working with us to find a way of getting some of that information.
But banning end-to-end encryption completely would destroy the internet as a place, as a marketplace, a place where people do their banking and purchase and stuff. It would totally devastate the internet economy in this country. So do you understand why people were so shocked when you appeared to suggest that's what you wanted to do?
But I never did suggest it. And what I have always said, because what I've always said is the internet provides an incredibly important place for people to do business. Encryption is important for banking, for everything else, as you say. But we need to do better to stop terrorists being able to use it.
In your interview today in the Mail on Sunday, you were asked whether or not electing a Labour government would result in more people being killed by terrorists, and you said yes. Do you really stand by that?
I would say look at the evidence. The evidence is that Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott and John McDonnell all have a history of not supporting terrorist legislation. Jeremy Corbyn has, in fact, in 2011 boasted that he opposed all counter-terrorism legislation. Andrew, it does worry me.
Diane Abbott gave quite a good account then of terrorist legislation which was counterproductive, badly thought through. In those cases, opposing it is the right thing to do.
No, I thought she gave a very poor account of not being able to engage with banning prescribed organisations such as the ones you suggest. We've banned them. We've banned a far-right group as well. I was the first Home Secretary to ban a far-right group, National Action. And what I would say to Diane Abbott is I've changed my hairstyle a few times in 34 years as well, but I have not changed my view about how we keep the British public safe.
All right, let's turn to one mainstream election issue, which was the embarrassing U-turn over social care. Damien Green, when he was sitting in that chair, I asked him directly, are you going to look again at this policy? He looked at me and he said, no. And then the next day you changed the policy radically. You produced a cap where there was going to be no cap. It has been an embarrassing U-turn. Is it not fooling the British people, taking them for fools, to pretend there hasn't been a U-turn?
No, I think that we've been very frank about it. I think we've levelled with people. The Conservative Party is a party that is very frank about these things, unlike the Labour Party.
Well,
yeah, no, I
really?
do think it is, yes.
Really?
I mean, we have put the most important element of that social care policy is that we're protecting £100,000 of people's assets, including their house. And we're making sure that they don't have to move from their house if they're using the equity from it while they're either at home using social care or elsewhere.
And you said as a government that there wouldn't be a cap. After the manifesto was launched, the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, went on the radio and said, we're getting rid of the cap. There will be no cap. So, is there going to be a cap?
So, well, the Prime Minister has said, yes, there will be a cap.
So that is a big change.
But we are not sure where the cap will be. What we are saying is we'll have a green paper to make sure that we set it at the right level and we consider all the other alternatives.
So it could be 200,000, it could be 300,000. All those people who were really worried about this policy when they heard it should still be worried until they know what the size of the cap is. Otherwise, they've got no protection.
I think that what people should realise is that we know that people are living longer. Over the next decade, there's going to be another 2 million people over 75, which is great news. But we have to be frank that this is going to cost money. We have to find a way that is fair for people to pay for it. This is the best route to do it.
Amber Rudd, for now, thank you very much indeed.
After the Manchester attack, will the final full week of election campaigning differ in tone from what came before? And my panel, of course, are here with me. Tim Marshall, it's going to be very much centre and front stage now, certainly for the next few days. Is that a good thing for the election or not, if it's going to be framed into who do you feel more safe?
It's inevitable, but I think it will only be part of the election because, as I said before the opt-out, for many voters this is also about economics, unemployment, things like that. It's not all about, as the Tories try to frame it, Brexit, nor is it only about security. What it will do, I hope, is get the tone of the debate right, although I've already seen the tone being lowered. I wasn't impressed with Mr Corbyn's speech last week, blaming it on foreign policy, which is just a wafer-thin analysis of what's going on.
Well, but also, it was inappropriate timing too soon?
Well, no, I just think the argument is utter nonsense. If you know anything about the jihadist movement, you know it's got very, very little to do with our foreign policy.
The former head of MI5 has told the Iraq inquiry that the terrorist threat from homegrown Muslim radicals increased substantially after the invasion of Iraq. Baroness Eliza Manningham-Buller said the numbers they had to investigate was pretty well more than they could cope with. From the inquiry, our correspondent Nicholas Witchell reports.
There was never any evidence, she said, that Saddam Hussein had anything to do with 9/11, and Iraq had then posed only a limited and containable threat. But then Britain took part in the invasion of Iraq, and the terrorist threat changed dramatically.
Our involvement in Iraq radicalised, for want of a better word, but a whole generation of young people, some of them British citizens, not a whole generation, a few among a generation, who were saw our involvement in Iraq, on top of our involvement in Afghanistan, as being an attack on Islam.
By 2004, she said, MI5 was pretty well swamped with intelligence about possible terrorist plots in the UK. And in Iraq itself, she said, Al-Qaeda had been given an unprecedented foothold.
And arguably, we gave Osama bin Laden his Iraqi jihad. So that he was able to move into Iraq in a way that he wasn't there before.
Did torture play into the hands of Al-Qaeda?
Yes. It's a propaganda coup for them to be able to say that the West, with its much vaunted principles, adopts these techniques.
And that's damaging to the West?
I believe so.
Al-Qaeda-inspired terrorism was about to bloody the streets of Europe, and the Iraq War would be blamed. Multiple bombs exploded on 4 commuter trains in Madrid. 191 people were killed. More than 1,800 were injured. In the bombers' video, they made it clear they'd attacked Spain because it had sent troops to Iraq.
We have thick smoke coming from the tunnel.
You need to clear now Russell Square.
It was the worst ever terrorist attack in Britain. 3 underground trains and a London bus were targeted by British suicide bombers. 52 people were killed that day, the 7th of July 2005. More than 700 were injured. Deep underground, Jill Hicks was fighting for her life.
I couldn't breathe. I could vaguely hear some screaming. I looked down and the ankles were just hanging by a thread to what remained of the rest of the legs. You're looking at yourself in a mutilated form, and it sort of didn't quite make any sense. And as I went to my right leg, my hand disappeared into my leg, and I thought, okay, this is even worse.
Jill then passed out, on the brink of being another fatality in the carnage. Her rescuers had no idea who she was.
My skin colour was jet black. My hair was completely burnt down. I, of course, was unable to speak. That morning, I was without identity. I was simply labelled one unknown, estimated female.
Again, the terrorists were British. Again, the young Muslims were motivated by the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan and the abuses in the secret war on terror.
They weren't people pushed out by the Al-Qaeda organization. They were people pulled into the revolution. And that represented for me an indication that the revolution was spreading and that we were in this for the long haul.
The leader of the group, Mohammed Sadiq Khan, made this video before attacking London.
Until you stop the bombing, gassing, imprisonment and torture of my people, we will not stop this fight. We are at war and I'm a soldier.
Binyam Mohammed, the 24-year-old Ethiopian who'd been living in London for 8 years, was arrested in Pakistan as he tried to leave the country. This was just the beginning of a 7-year ordeal across 3 continents. Binyam Mohammed says that in Pakistan he was hung by his wrists, beaten with a leather strap and subjected to a mock execution. He alleges MI5 was aware he was being tortured. His case would raise questions about what the British government knew about his treatment. General Pervez Musharraf was president of Pakistan throughout most of this time when many terrorist suspects were interrogated. And Musharraf was a crucial ally in the West's war against Al-Qaeda.
We are dealing with vicious people. And we have to get information. Now, if we are extremely decent, we then don't get any information. We need to allow leeway to the intelligence operatives, the people who interrogate.
Complicity in torture is a criminal offence, but a police investigation into Mohammed's allegations has not resulted in prosecution.
The longer these questions remain unanswered, the bigger the stain on our reputation as a country that believes in freedom and fairness and human rights.
Last year, the government took the unusual step of paying compensation to Binyam Mohammed and other alleged victims of torture and rendition, without accepting any liability.
It left a bit of an unpleasant taste in the mouth. But on the other hand, better to get that out of the way and let counter-terrorist professionals focus on what they're supposed to be focusing on, which is stopping further terrorist attacks.
The government has now set up an official inquiry to examine all the allegations of British complicity in torture. Many allege they were tortured in Pakistan and forced into confessions by its notorious intelligence agency, the ISI. Saladin Amin from Luton alleges he was visited by MI5 whilst being tortured in Pakistan over 10 months.
Whenever he was being interviewed, they would at times blindfold him, and they had these belts of different sizes that they called chittar. They would beat him up with those. They scared him with a drill.
With a drill?
Yeah.
What did they do?
And they'd say things like they'll put a hole up his backside.
He was told by the ISI officers that it's our friends that want you, referring to the United Kingdom officials. But the interesting part about this is that he was also interviewed by the United Kingdom officials approximately 10 or 11 or 12 times, around that time from Saladin Amin's recollection.
Later, at London's Paddington police station, Amin confessed to involvement in a bomb plot. He was sentenced to life. But he insists this was a miscarriage of justice because of his torture and British complicity in it.
I am very clear that we are not and have not been complicit in torture. And I'm in no doubt that all the countries concerned, including Pakistan and indeed the United States, were very well aware of what British policy was, which was we don't do this, we don't ask other people to do it.
The British government say they told Pakistan, perhaps you directly, that they do not want the ISI to torture British citizens, British subjects. Have you any recollection of that being said to you on behalf of the British government?
Never. Never once. I don't remember at all.
They haven't said to you, we're concerned about the treatment that British subjects are getting in Pakistan, please don't do it, don't torture them?
No.
We don't agree with it?
No, no.
Nothing?
Not at all.
Would you be surprised if they'd said that to you?
Well, maybe they wanted us to carry on whatever we were doing. It was a tacit approval of whatever we were doing.
President Musharraf told me that maybe they wanted us to carry on with whatever we were doing. It was tacit approval. That's what...
He's wrong. There was no tacit approval of torture.
There was no blind eye turned?
No.
Is Britain complicit in torture?
No. I think this raises a much broader question. Al-Qaeda is a global threat. to counter it, we need to talk to services throughout the world. We have to be careful and cautious in some of those relationships. But to decide that we're never going to talk to the following 50 countries in any circumstances means that you are deciding deliberately not to try and find out information that you need to know.
In 2006, a secret government document about dealing with foreign agencies considered that in extreme circumstances, life-saving intelligence should be weighed against the level of mistreatment anticipated. In 2010, the document was revised and that reference omitted. And that's the difficult dilemma. MI5 cannot avoid dealing with Pakistan's intelligence services, whatever their notoriety. This has prompted a fierce debate in America about the justification for torture.
It would be absurd to say that torture never gets a result that's true. Of course it does. I mean, I could torture you and get your name very quickly. But your question, the first question you always have to ask is this: is torturing someone making the world safer? Or is it actually inspiring people that we're such hypocrites about democracy and the rule of law that they hate us more? Now, you cannot look at the last 10 years and say that what we did in Guantanamo Bay and the torture that we've done elsewhere has made the world safer. That's just an untenable position.
The intelligence from torture is often unreliable, but although it's unfashionable to say so, in some circumstances it can save lives, however immoral it may be. So is torture justified? In a democratic society, the answer has to be no. And there's another danger. Once the methods utilized in the secret war on terror were exposed, Al-Qaeda would be gifted a propaganda victory. Because alongside the secret war was a very public battle for hearts and minds. In the very month Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was waterboarded, that battle was about to begin in earnest. The invasion of Iraq, a Muslim country, enraged Islamic communities around the world. In London, the Joint Intelligence Committee had privately warned Prime Minister Tony Blair of an increased risk of radicalisation.
We were beginning to be very concerned about radicalisation. Once it was clear that we were going to be engaged in Iraq, we became increasingly aware that a number of young British citizens were supportive of the Al-Qaeda ideology and prepared to help. It was from the time of the Iraq War that the great increase in that radicalisation became detectable.
Did you foresee it?
Not fully. We anticipated there would be some, but not to that extent. Not to the extent there was.
Hang on, but I don't want to attack just one side. The Conservative, I don't know which minister, has already said that you would be safer under a Tory minister. It has got nothing to do whether there's a Labour or a Tory government, the danger of the next Islamist attack. Absolutely nothing to do with it. That is saying as if it's something to do with Labour and Tory policies. It's to do with jihadist ideology.
Right, and it was Amber Rudd who made that comment. But you raise an important issue about tone. Because it also points to a broader argument, the one we were having earlier, that has politics been too cautious with this issue of extremism? Has the conversation about it by politicians tiptoed round some of the difficult sensitive issues? And by the media, Steve?
Yeah, but you see, you highlight the problem of this being part of the election campaign when you say, has politics been too cautious about it? Who do you mean by politics? In an election campaign, there has got to be, and there's a duty to be, a divide, an argument about values, policies, and so on. As Tim was very interesting there, security is an issue that in a way transcends those political divides. So I think it is deeply unhealthy. It's nobody's fault a tragedy occurred.
Yes, you do not think it's going to help this election.
If you ask me, does it help or enhance an election debate? Emphatically not. Security often brings, or a tragic event brings politics, as you called it, together. Security is an issue that is complex and doesn't divide neatly. Elections are political battles by definition. So I think the coming together of this is, I mean, a tragedy occurred anyway, but it is an unfortunate context.
Do you agree with that? Do you agree with that, Julia, or do you think this is a time to talk about these sorts of issues, and it is a time to review, as I say, the level of argument that is disposed?
This is a political debate. I frankly think that the politicians should be out and about on Wednesday. There is no wrong time to get it right. They shouldn't have been delaying things so long. This whole we mustn't let the terrorists change our way of life. When they disrupt our election campaign and we allow them to do so, then they have absolutely disrupted our way of life. The reality is, it is a political debate, and it may be party political, but I think for an awful lot of voters, including me, I want to hear from party leaders and the Home Secretary, Shadow Home Secretaries alike, what do you plan to do about this? And right now, I've not heard anything that suggests anyone in our political leadership in any of these parties have got to grips with the real problem, which is we are not actually tackling the problem that is in our midst. Douglas Murray was touching on earlier, we have not even come to grips with the scale of the problem.
Does Labour have a point when it talks about terrorism legislation, just before we finish this discussion, Steve Richards, in terms that, you know, I am obviously saying that Jeremy Corbyn hadn't voted for various pieces of legislation, but it is complicated, and obviously not all of it's worked or is actually used enough by government.
It's another example where this doesn't work in an election debate, because David Davis has opposed a lot of this terrorism legislation. He's now Brexit Secretary.
Very different grounds, though.
In some cases, but not always. There's a sort of civil liberties argument, which I personally have doubts about, that again brings people together from all the major parties. So they do, and Corbyn didn't actually say it was the cause of terrorism, British foreign policy, but it helped to facilitate terrorism, which is a different argument. But again, that would be supported by some Tories as well. That's why it's difficult in an election campaign for this issue to dominate in this way.
Let's take a look at the front page of the Sunday Times, because it talks about a campaign relaunch, which may not come as a great surprise following the social care fiasco and then the U-turn. Do we know what that's going to entail, the relaunch?
Well, it sounds like Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, is going to play a little bit of a role. The whole point wasn't it was supposed to be Theresa May, this is all about her, and it turns out that isn't quite good enough, as we were saying earlier. The more we've seen of Theresa May, rather less impressive she's looked. I mean, certainly with that Andrew Neil interview the night of the terror attack in Manchester, just repeating the same thing again and again, not answering the question. Voters don't like that. They like people who are honest with them and actually engage with the voters. And when we see these interviews that are coming up in the next few days, I think it's going to be really interesting to see whether she changes tack and actually tries to engage with what people are actually asking her.
And if it's back to leadership and Brexit, and then I suppose if you follow that through the economy, which is what you were talking about, will that be more comfortable ground for her?
I think so, and I understand framing it in strong and stable, or, you know, she thinks that it is all about Brexit, and there will be a selection of the electorate that thinks, yeah, you know, it is about Brexit, but no, she's got to broaden it out. I think that's why she is broadening it out. I don't think that the security and the tragedy of Manchester will absolutely dominate, because if it did, that would be a very small victory for terrorism. You know, this is a country of 65 million people with an awful lot of issues. I agree with Julia about confronting the real issue, and I don't think people do. Nevertheless, we've got 65 million votes, well, 65 million people with opinions coming up in 2 weeks' time.
Now, it's quite a long campaign when you take it in the round, and there is still time to go. What do you think Labour will be focusing on from now on?
Well, I imagine they will look very closely at where they are well ahead in the polls and focus on that relentlessly, i.e. public services, NHS and things like that, and try and get it off as soon as possible from security and these issues, which on one level at least appear to be a gift to the Conservatives. So I assume that's what they're going to do. But this is a very unpredictable campaign where nothing has gone according to plan.
Right, well, let's look ahead, because on Wednesday evening we've got one of the BBC's election debates for 2 hours in Cambridge. Lucky old them. It's leaders of some of the parties, and Amber Rudd is going to be representing the Conservatives. We don't know yet who is going to be representing Labour, but of course today we've already had Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, and Diane Abbott, the lady who would like to be Home Secretary, up against each other on Andrew Marr. Let's have a look.
I think there's something to be said
for a Home Secretary who's actually worked in the Home Office. I worked in the Home Office for nearly 3 years as a graduate trainee.
This government has always felt that urgency. That's why we've been putting additional money, additional resources, and that's why also, I mean, it is significant that the Commission for Extremism that is in the manifesto was put in before Manchester. We know we need to do more.
You voted against prescribing those groups?
Because there were groups on that list which I deemed to be dissidents rather than terror organisations.
We are making good progress with the companies who have put in place end-to-end encryption. Some of them are being more constructive than others, but we will continue to build on that.
But what I'm saying to you is this. It was 34 years ago. I had a rather splendid afro at the time. I don't have the same hairstyle. And I don't have the same views. It is 34 years on. The hairstyle has gone and some of the views have gone.
So you no longer, you regret the fact of what you said then about the IRA?
The hairstyle has gone, the views have gone.
What I would say to Diane Abbott is I've changed my hairstyle a few times in 34 years as well, but I have not changed my view about how we keep the British public safe.
Well, let's get away from hairstyles momentarily. But no, let's. And talk about the prospect of perhaps the two of them taking part in that election debate. Would you like to see that, Amber Rudd and Diane Abbott?
I would like, well, on one level I'd like to see it, on one level I'd like to see an intelligent debate, so perhaps not. By the way, I've never had an afro or supported the IRA. The reality is, if you've got the question there where Jeremy Corbyn has been forefront of this Labour campaign, whenever Diane Abbott steps out in a TV studio or in a radio studio, they hemorrhage votes, because she cannot say things like, I regret supporting this or that legislation. I mean, she's an absolute disaster. If Labour put her up, they are beyond mad.
Who do you think Labour should put up? If it is Amber Rudd, and we have the leaders of the other parties, of the Liberal Democrats, of Plaid, of Greens, we have Angus Robertson for the SNP and the UKIP leader, who would you suggest?
By the way, I did have an afro. I based my whole look on Kevin Keegan, and it was good. That's the wrong question. One of the interesting things in this, I'll explain why. The Labour campaign, it seems to me, there are sort of only 5 or 6 people put up for all the outlets. Now, that is both the fault of others who have refused to take part, but it also shows the degree to which the current leadership can only rely, it seems, on 5 or 6 people. So I imagine we're talking of a pool of about 5 or 6 people. If you ask my judgment as to who is the best public performer in that pool, it would be, by some margin, John McDonnell, who is a very good interviewee and performer. He's not bad, but I think McDonnell is a very good performer.
And it would come back to the economy, presumably, at some part. I mean, do you think would be...
But then it comes back to the IRA and his support
on Wednesday. Yes, I mean, that issue would no doubt be raised.
I don't think debates when if it's 7 are that illuminating, but if it's 2 or 3, I think they can be. I think if Amber Rudd is there, Diane Abbott should be there. I think the leaders should be debating each other. Some people say it's froth. I think the electorate gets a sense of the person when they're put up against each other. Briefly, on haircuts, I would like to thank both of them for talking about haircuts, because I'm looking forward to tomorrow's papers, the cartoons, the sketch writers, and a theme that will run through the week.
Right, well, that'll take us slightly away from some of the other issues we've been talking about. Let's not finish on the hair, though, but thank you very much for being our guest today.